to include cases of populism.
I think she had a technical problem. She left. I'm asking your patience just for 1 minute. She'll be back. I think she had a technical problem. She left. I'm asking your patience just for 1 minute. She'll be back.
There is a kind of black hole. I don't know why. Teresa?
I don't know what. I'm back.
Okay, welcome.
So welcome everybody to the second panel of Mapping Global Populism, organized by ECPS. After concluding our Mapping European Populism panel series, ECPS is moving beyond the borders of Europe and expanding its project to include cases of populism around the world by organizing a new panel series to map global populism, bringing scholars together every month to discuss the state of political populism in a different region of the world. Today will be the second session hosting 5 prominent scholars, and we will examine populism, macho-fascism, and varieties of illiberalism in the Philippines. The aim is to have a complete picture of populism around the globe with monthly sessions throughout the year. Each session, ECPS publishes a panel report with a video recording on its website. This is an invaluable source of information, not only for scholars, but also for a wider audience, including policymakers concerned by current challenges to democracy in the world posed by populist politics. Okay, so after this brief explanation, let me introduce our panelists today. To begin with, Paul Kenny. Paul Kenny is professor and director of the Political Science program at the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at Australian Catholic University and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University. Dr. Kenny is the author of 3 books, Populism and Patronage, Why Populists Win Elections in India, Asia and Beyond, Oxford University Press 2017, which won the American Political Science Association 2018 Robert Dahl Award, Populism in Southeast Asia, Cambridge University Press 2019, and most recently, Why Populism, Political Strategy from Ancient Greece to the Present. He has a PhD in political science from Yale University and degrees in economics and political economy from the London School of Economics and Trinity College, Dublin. Our first speaker is Dr. Adele Webb, and she will be giving a lecture on populism, illiberalism, and authoritarianism in the Philippines from past to present. Dr. Adele Webb joined the University of Canberra Center for Deliberate Democracy and Global Governance in 2023 as research fellow in democracy and citizen engagement. She is an early career political sociologist, reached the University of Sydney 2019, researching how citizens think about democracy, when and why they hold ambivalent attitudes to democracy, and how subjectivities and the political unconscious affect their engagement with democratic processes. Adele's work has been published in academic journals and edited books, including the Duterte Reader, Democratic Theory, and Populism Around the World. Her first monograph, Chasing Freedom, The Philippines' Long Journey to Democratic Ambivalence, was published by Liverpool University Press and Ateneo de Manila University Press in 2022. Our second speaker is Dr. Mark Richard Thompson. Dr. Thompson will focus on populism in the Philippines in a historical context with a presentation titled Duterte's Violent Populism in Comparative and Historical Perspective. Dr. Mark Thompson is Professor of Politics, Department of Asian and International Studies, and Director, Southeast Asia Research Center, and at the City University of Hong Kong. He is past president of the Hong Kong Political Science Association and the Asian Political and International Studies Association. Thompson is the author of or editor of 10 books and over 200 articles, many in top journals and book chapters. His research focuses on autocratization, presidentialism, authoritarian developmentalism, and dynastic national leadership in East Asia, Northeast and Southeast Asia. His research has been cited over 3,600 times, according to Google Scholar, and has been featured in the popular media. He lends his expertise to government, public foundations, and non-government organizations in the areas of East Asian politics and development. Dr. Jean Encinas Franco will be our third speaker presenting on masculinity and populism in the Philippines. Her lecture's title is Gendered Populism of Totalitarismo and Hypermasculinity in the Philippines Politics. Dr. Jean Encinas Franco is currently a professor in the Department of Political Science, College of Social Sciences and Philosophy, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Before she entered the academy, she worked for 15 years at the Senate of the Philippines, where she was director of the Senate Economic Planning Office. She also lectured at the International Studies Department of Miriam College from 1999 to 2009, and was a faculty associate of its Women and Gender Studies Institute. Her research focuses on labor migration and gender discourses of migrant workers. She teaches gender and political and feminist international relations. And this takes us to our fourth speaker, Dr. Jefferson Leiden Ragraggio. Dr. Ragraggio will talk on media populism in the Philippines with a lecture titled Media Populism and Anti-Free Speech in Duterte's Philippines. Dr. Jefferson Leiden Ragraggio is an assistant professor at the Department of Science Communication, College of Development Communication, University of the Philippines at Los Baños. His research focuses on media populism, journalism, and digital politics. Trained in media studies, his recent work on populism and religion appeared in the International Communication Association and Oxford University Press Journal Communication, Culture and Critique. He earned his PhD from the School of Communication, Hong Kong Baptist University. And just a quick reminder that we do the Q&A session after the completion of the presentations. You can write your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand and pose your questions in person. Before leaving the floor to Paul Kenny, I would like to also remind you that this panel will be recorded.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Teresa. As Teresa mentioned, my name is Paul Kenny, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion and setting us off with a few observations to get us thinking about the problem of Duterte's populist administration in the Philippines. So I want to begin with what I think we could say are a number of facts, or as close to facts as I think we can get. Although Duterte is out of office, he's left this legacy for the study of populism and the study of democracy more broadly, and it forces us to challenge a lot of our preconceptions. So some of the facts are these. By pretty much any measure and any source, Duterte's 6-year term in office was extraordinarily violent. Official figures put the death toll of extrajudicial killings at somewhere around the 6,000, but those of NGOs, human rights organizations, and other civil society monitors and journalists put the figure over 20,000, maybe even closer to 30,000. Among those deaths were, in fact, those of many journalists, a development that coincided with this general erosion of press freedom in the Philippines during the Duterte government. There was also repression of judicial autonomy with frequent interferences and intimidation of the judiciary, including indeed the deaths of some judges and lawyers. Despite this, what you might call a liberal and certainly discomforting record, Duterte remained throughout his term in office extraordinarily popular. Unlike any of his other post-EDSA predecessors in the Philippines, his popularity didn't dip after an initial honeymoon period, whether of a few months or a few years. He remained popular right the way through to the end of his administration. This support was also widespread across demographics. My own analysis of the public opinion data shows that it was generally higher for younger and better educated Filipinos. And interestingly, given the topic of some of the discussions that'll happen later on, although he was initially more popular among men, this gender gap actually disappeared after the first few months of his administration, after which point there was no gap in popularity or approval of Duterte among men and women. Duterte was especially popular for his signature war on drugs, war on illegal drugs campaign. This campaign in particular, of all of the policies of the Duterte government, met with extremely high approval, usually up around 90%. But his administration was not popular only because of the war on drugs. So despite his public buffoonery on occasions, he attended very carefully to economic matters, especially inflation. And the data show very clearly that his popularity tracks inflation. Whenever it went up, his popularity suffered its only sort of modest declines, and he was very careful to then seek to address inflation. And this is true both on a national level and also on a subnational level. So economic issues were never sort of far from the mind of Duterte and his pollsters and administrators. Duterte, of course, sought to influence the succession to his sort of chief ally, Senator Bongo, with his daughter Sara proposed as vice president. The internal machinations among that elite eventually scuppered these plans, with Sara essentially rejecting this idea. But in the end, he couldn't secure his preferred succession. And this, in many ways, is the very definition of democracy, that an election removed him from office and prevented him from determining who would follow him. So, in short, we have this kind of paradoxical situation, which is that Duterte was quite illiberal on many key issues, especially around checks on the executive, both judicial checks on the executive, legislative checks on the executive, and the so-called fourth estate on press freedom and public checks on executive power. Nevertheless, he remained extraordinarily popular, and the regime remained essentially democratic. So this is a real puzzle, and my own intuition and sort of what I've been writing about is that populism can perhaps help us fill the gap and provide an explanation. I'll return to this in some of my comments at the end as we sum up, but to flag some of the issues that I think the concept of populism and theories of populism can help us resolve are the fact that Duterte was very much a charismatic leader, an individual leader who portrayed his administration as being essentially personalist rule, albeit personalist rule sanctified by democratic elections, by popularity. This meant that Duterte had a very limited political organization. So he relied extraordinarily on popular support, on direct relationship with the people. And this meant that in some ways, in contrast to regular political parties, the kind we're often used to in the West, he couldn't rely on any guaranteed backing. So he paid a great deal of attention to public opinion polls and was quite sensitive to them. So in addition to leading the public, Duterte also very much followed the public. And I think that this tells us something about populism in general too, where we're often conditioned to think of populists as demagogues who lead the people and drag them along to their own sort of Machiavellian purposes. Very often what we see is that populists are the ones who provide a mirror to the people and actually reflect popular views. So in the Philippines case, this obviously raises some disturbing implications, which is that we have essentially popular illiberal democracy, or popularly illiberal views. And I'm interested to hear what some of our panelists have to say about this. I'm sure we're going to hear about a lot of the negative things that Duterte has done, but we have to think about what this means in a democracy if those negative things, including something as destructive as the war on drugs, are actually popular. So I'm going to leave it there with what I hope is a provocative framing for our discussion and pass it over to the first of our speakers for tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. That's me, and I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully that is coming across for everyone. And you can see that. Okay, great. Well, thank you for the chance to be part of this panel, and greetings from Brisbane, Australia, where I currently am. I'm on the country of the Yugara and Turrbal nations, Indigenous custodians of this land who never ceded sovereignty. And this is an important year for us in Australia, as we will vote in a referendum to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their voices in our constitution. But of course, the subject of today's panel is a different contested landscape, not a dry ancient island continent, but a tropical archipelago with a much longer colonial history. And in the time that I have today, I want to structure my reflections on populism in the Philippines, past and present, around three ideas or three findings that I think are pertinent to our deeper understanding of this phenomenon as it manifests in the Philippine context, but which also contribute, I hope, to some closing reflections on how the Philippine case and its dynamics might sharpen our use of the term populism more generally. So in thinking about the existence of populism in the Philippines, there are three broad things that are significant to note. The first is the fact that, like many other post-colonial democracies, there are permanent features of the political arena, both in terms of institutions and in terms of voter attitudes, that match descriptive representations of populism. Characteristics of the political landscape that provide a favourable political opportunity structure for populist politics. So, as we probably know very well, the electoral arena is dominated by moralistic rather than programmatic appeals. And in the context of weak parties and almost the almost total absence of ideologically and ethically driven partisan identities, democratic competitions founded on social cleavages or competing ideas are very rare. Instead, political actors vying for power foster a sense of symbolic, performative, vertical accountability between the people and themselves, portraying themselves as the main custodian of public interests and citizen demands. Citizens, for their part, tend to be more tolerant of strong executive power with limited legislative intervention, desiring quick fixes and decisive actions. And all of this, of course, relates to what scholars have pointed out already, that the Philippines is a quintessential case of O'Donnell's delegative democracy categorization. What is more, pluralism is weak. The political actors use this and reinforce it by talking of a unified people, as if the country needs to have one heart, one soul, one mind, and only then can it overcome the challenges that it faces. Together, these factors provide a fertile ground for populist appeals. And while actors that we might describe as populists come and go, the resonance and potency of populist sentiment remains. And we see this, for example, in the striking consistency in political rhetoric of key presidential figures. The way Cory Aquino talked about the path to transformation when she was elected following the spectacular deposing of the late Marcos in 1986 was at times almost indistinguishable from the way Manuel Quezon talked about transformation in the late 30s and early 40s, and even the way Marcos himself talked about it. She made herself custodian of the nation and its prosperity, perpetuating the motive of people power. She spoke not in conservative, but in revolutionary terms. Now the country is back in our hands. Another revolution is about to begin, she told an audience of workers on Labor Day in 1986. If Marcos had become demonized as the epitome of Philippines' moral corruption, Aquino was the opposite, symbolizing everything that was morally good. Despite the seeming division between good and bad, she said, only the power of a unified people could make it succeed. The late Marcos and Duterte, in their authoritarian populist style, also spoke of good moral citizens who were deserving of rights versus those who weren't. Yet arguably, their populist ideology also traded more on the idea of unity than it did on division. And of course, the closing of democratic spaces by calling for unity should remind us of the most recent election. The platform of joint Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte ticket was unity, unifying the North and the South, unifying two powerful political families, and unifying the country against disruptive opposition voices who want to raise questions about the sins of both fathers. And this leads me to my second point, that I think is noteworthy when considering populism in the Philippine context. That despite the permanent presence of populist features on the political landscape, some things considered integral to the rise of populism elsewhere are largely missing in the Philippines. So in European liberal democracies, the rise of populist politics has gone hand in hand with increasing political polarization, the radicalization of publics and discourse, hyper-partisan media that fosters the antagonism. Together, these two phenomena, populism and polarization, are deemed the great threat to the liberal democratic order. In contrast to this, the Philippines stands out as a country with low political polarization. Paul has written about this, along with others. Duterte's popularity took on an almost unipolar nature. It's not to say that there were not opponents inside and outside Congress, but instead of developing into a coherent anti-populist bloc, as has been observed elsewhere, Duterte enjoyed unprecedented cross-class approval that endured his 6-year term. There's an important exception to this. Before Duterte, whenever the Philippines was invoked in discussions of populism, it was Joseph Estrada, or ERUP, who was named. But Estrada represented a different brand of populism. He defied the mold of a typical Philippine president. The us and them of ERUP's highly persuasive populist performance was based on material grievances, on the deep social and economic inequalities that mark society. His chains of vertical loyalty were not with a unified moral people, but predominantly with the poor. And for the first time, populism produced pernicious polarization. Both the Grand Coalition of anti-Estrada, anti-populist, the Grand Coalition of the anti-Estrada, anti-populist movement, and those who mobilized in Estrada's defense, each saw the other as the enemy of democracy and themselves as democracy's true agents. So if over the long history of politics in the Philippines, this is the exception, then how do we understand the grievances and anxieties that have driven populist politics, particularly the authoritarian or illiberal kind of Duterte and the late Marcos, which uses populist sentiment to legitimize state repression? The third point I want to make is that to understand the resonance of populist appeals and the logic of populist voters in accepting them, we need to consider their deep historical roots. So there are novel features of Duterte's regime that deserve attention, of course, not to mention the victims of his vile war on drugs. But at the same time, if we're using populism as an analytical concept, we should place his politics in a long view, and we should seek to understand the logics that drive his appeal in historical context. If we don't historicize our analyses, at least two things are at stake. The first is we continue to give too much power to populist actors, as if they have made people do things that are simply cruel, that make no sense, and have no relationship to their democratic desires. And second, if we don't historicize, we fail to acknowledge that political attitudes and political institutions are produced by and producers of the conditions of possibility. So let's consider Duterte's platform. It was based around igniting two sources of popular anxiety. The first related to law and order. The Philippines had become a narco state, and economic growth and political stability were impossible if this problem wasn't eradicated. It's going to be a dictatorship, he warned in a 2015 interview. The police and the military will be the backbone. And his electoral campaign translated into a state-sanctioned killing spree. But this wasn't the only anxiety Duterte inflamed. His was also a populist nationalism. It played upon the fragile sovereignty of the post-colonial Philippines. He claimed to embody the Philippines' defiance of an unresolved history of colonial subjugation and indignity. The resonance of this was vividly captured when he infamously cursed US President Obama during a press conference in Davao. I am a president of a sovereign state, and we have long since ceased to be a colony. I do not have any master but the Filipino people, he said. The antagonism here was not between moral citizens versus criminal scum, but a unified and sovereign Filipino people against a malignant foreigner. The latter anxiety, I would argue, has been mostly ignored, perhaps because it implicates non-Filipinos, but I'll come back to this. The former, the law and order pitch, has gained most attention. The grotesqueness of the war on drugs has proved both hard to watch and hard to look away from. Many people at the moment are abusing their freedom and doing things which are not good, said one of my interviewees in September 2015. But we have this one politician, Duterte, whose type of leadership is like Marcos, and many people like that. And if you see Davao right now, it is one of the safest places in the Philippines. For me, if that type of leadership is implemented again, I think it's much better. How to make sense of these sentiments? Some have explained it as evidence of lingering authoritarian nostalgia from the Marcos period. Others argue it's a case of penal populism, in which modest economic growth empowers an expanding middle class who express their anxiety about criminality and government corruption. While both these explanations bear some truth, both need to be further historicised, as this sentiment predates the post-1986 era. I found in my research that as far back as the 1940s, a perceived need for discipline was shaping middle-class perceptions of what was a legitimate exercise of democratic power, in particular the type of leadership that was deemed necessary. In the late 1950s, Karl Lander noted that the general increase in crime and disorder since the end of the war had led people to say that there's too much democracy and that a little less democracy would be better for the country. By the early 1970s, when Marcos declared the resuscitation of Philippine democracy as only possible through his strong autocratic leadership, a newspaper columnist at the time summed up the prevailing mood. For lack of discipline, the nation plunged into the depths. It was exactly what the president did. He put a stop to a total lack of discipline. The argument that I've made in my book is that these sentiments reflect a sustained ambivalence towards democracy, and that ambivalence in turn has its roots in the paradox of democratic empire that was unleashed on the Philippines by the United States from the turn of the last century. If we want to talk about the electorate's propensity for patronage politics, then we must talk about Philippine democracy's founding patron. There is a striking resemblance between the logic, this logic of the electorate, the way democratic progress is imagined, and the way the US colonial project of benign authoritarianism operated in the Philippines. It was a logic of pursuing national dignity and democratic ideals through the denial of liberty, acceptance of the repression of rights for the greater good was deemed the appropriate behaviour of the good student of American democratic tutelage. And like in other post-colonial contexts, these imperial logics of governance have penetrated the psyche and imaginings of how democracy works, and they are very difficult to shake. So let me conclude by making some final remarks about what the complex case of the Philippines means for our understanding of populism more generally. If the logics that drive populism in the Philippines are deeply rooted in colonial history, what, if anything, does it have to do with populism elsewhere? Can the term traverse such diverse contexts? It can, I believe, but only if we see populism not as the problem with our political systems, but as a manifestation of grievances with existing institutions of representative democracy, a signal of the failure of regimes to adequately express the political aspirations of people and to give effect to notions that are supposedly central to our democratic normative ideal, popular sovereignty and constituent power. This is not to defend populism as a model of political change, but to say that if we blame the unsustainability of our democracies on populism, we sideline and ignore the causes of the feelings of alienation that propel it. In the Philippines, this is an old story. The institutions of representative democracy were compromised at their conception under a US colonial administration. At its core, the rise of populism is about the failure of institutions of democracy to ever accommodate the constituency beyond the populist performative realm. In Europe, it's a more recent phenomenon, accelerated by cultural shifts brought about by neoliberalism and the digital transformation of our social lives. But in both places, populist voters conclude that the only way to make the principle of popular sovereignty effective is to delegate power to a strong, usually male and blustering figurehead, whose transgressions of liberal representative institutions they mostly forgive due to the lack of alternative means for addressing deep-seated structural inequalities. Thanks for listening.
I guess I'm next. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and I will try to go onto the full screen mode when I'm capable of doing that. As I've mentioned earlier, I'm a bit technologically challenged. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation and the initiative from ECPS for this program, this outreach, as it were, beyond the European context. And I just want to add that I think a problem with populism studies, and Paul's work is an obvious exception, is that it is, or it has been, often very Eurocentric, although the US gets an honorable mention recently. And Latin America kind of sneaks in. The Latin Americanists have been studying populism, as Adele was pointing out, longer than, well, she's saying it's fairly recent in Europe, but it's been longer in the context of Latin America. So that's an interesting aspect that in the recent studies, particularly in political science, a lot of the material is drawn from the European cases. So I think it's really a great initiative to have this Philippine centric focus here. And I'm pleased, of course, to be able to join in on this. So let me start out by picking up on some of the comments already made by Paul, particularly his point about the paradox of democratic illiberalism, very important in this case, obviously, and Adele's ideas about democratic ambivalence, the nationalist component of Duterte's appeal, the historical element I haven't really emphasized in my presentation, but that is also of vital importance. I would add, of course, she mentioned Quezon's Commonwealth. This was a kind of strange colonial late colonial invention on the part of the Americans, and Quezon became increasingly dictatorial. The advent of World War II prevented a full-scale dictatorship by Quezon himself, then Marcos's martial law, of course. This is a bit beyond the populist realm, but the idea of executive aggrandizement, which, as Paul showed and Adele was talking about as well, Duterte was engaged in, has a lot of precedence in Philippine history as well. And I'll also be foreshadowing, perhaps is one way you could put it, Jean's discussions of Duterte's misogyny. I hope not trespassing too much, Jean. I'll just keep it brief. and also about Jeff on social media, even briefer, although I do hope in the discussion afterwards we have a chance to discuss the role of social media, particularly the causal role in trying to figure out how important it was for the rise of Duterte and now for his successor, Marcos Jr. So my emphasis here is on the the comparative aspect, as was mentioned in my subtitle, and Duterte does seem to reflect global trends during his presidency, and yet the important distinction is that he was the only illiberal populist to instigate mass murder of tens of thousands. I've taken a close look at these figures, just did some research recently, and it's not just the NGOs, it's the Commission on Human Rights, a government agency, which Duterte tried to defund, his allies in Congress did, ultimately backed away from that, but also an initiative at the University of the Philippines to do counting, and some international groups that have been coming up with database. So I think we can safely, for choice of words, we can speak of tens of thousands murdered. And also, of course, the Philippine government under Duterte, when they went from this acclamatory phase, when they were proud of the killings and they were bringing out the media and saying, look at these, what we're doing to stop drug criminality. Look at these dead pushers and small-time drug users with these signs onto their mangled bodies to show that they are actually taking this state-led vigilante action. They changed their approach after an incredible pushback internationally and domestically. Although that didn't stop the drug war, it did lead them to change the counting and to intentionally obscure the numbers of those killed. Anyway, back to my point. The point is Duterte is distinctive because he was engaged in mass murder against his own citizens. I mean, we talk about other illiberal populists, talk about Putin invading Ukraine, but this is war on the Filipino people. And it's a particularly virulent form of liberalism as it takes the aggressive intent, which is obvious in this idea of us versus them, the populist polarity to deadly extremes. And the othering is based not on religion or ethnicity or migration or whatever it is, but it's othering outsiders. It's against the poor because it's overwhelmingly, with the important exception of the journalists, the judges, I should also add the local mayors, about over half of those identified by Duterte as linked to the drug trade were actually murdered. So, and there were a few high profile cases of celebrities. Even a celebrity was killed in the drug war, but it's overwhelmingly a war against the poor. It was poor young males in particular, urban poor males who were victims. And yet, as we've heard, Duterte won popular support, including among the poor. Very interesting ethnological studies on that as well as of course the opinion polls. And this is distinctive from these base populists, from Bolsonaro, from Trump. They have in highly polarized societies, they have a very affectionate base that doesn't care what these characters are up to. Duterte has effectively a vast portion of the population supporting him. There is a footnote here. There's some increasing discussion about whether Duterte's support is due to fear. I think there was that factor. I think the jury's still a bit out, but I think at the end of the day, we'll see that overwhelmingly it was genuine support, even though if there was a bit of a fear factor, people were, particularly poor people, for obvious reasons, concerned that the drug war might actually affect them personally or members of their family. As Adele also mentioned, one framework for understanding Duterte has been the penal populist one. But crime concerns, and I want to point this out, given this concern with law and order, or better said, order over law, is that these concerns, as opinion polling shows, were limited until Duterte securitized drugs in the 2016 campaign, as Kimpo showed us his chapter in this in the Duterte Reader. And if you see here this chart, if it's legible to you, crime, which is the lowest most dashed line here, jumps up briefly during Duterte's campaign from December 2015 to his election, takes office, and then it goes back down. Inflation, as Paul mentioned, a very important consideration of Filipinos till today, and other factors becoming more important. And the other thing is that penal populism has generally been involved with, people being arrested and put in jail for a long time, and that happened in the Philippines, certainly, mass arrests, but there were also these mass killings, extrajudicial killings as they're known in the Philippines. And the drug war continued despite this growing domestic and international criticism. In terms of the origins and nature of Duterte's violent populism, one has to understand how he nationalized it after having first developed it locally in Davao as mayor for a number of terms. And one of the interesting things is that Duterte was actually appointed vice mayor by Cory Aquino. And there is a tie between the Aquinos and the Dutertes, and they have a lot of mutual friends, and it's an interesting story there. But he became this popular mayor, dealing with the communist insurgency, dealing with high crime rates, and he came up with this new idea of what can be called neo-bosses. Instead of intimidating voters and saying, get in line and vote for me, you know where the guns are, he wooed them and did so by saying, I'm directing my ire at your enemy as well, that is being the drug dealers and users. And therefore, he's promising to protect the good people against drug-induced evil. So again, this populist polarity working in his favor without upsetting voters, actually attracting voters. And this resonates, I've argued, particularly given the failures of what can be called the liberal reformist regime from Cory Aquino to Fidel Ramos, her successor. The Estrada administration was a bit of the exception. The liberal reformists didn't like that. They overthrew Estrada extra constitutionally. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo was Estrada's successor. She was supposed to be a liberal, turned out to be a very problematic administration. But then the son of Cory Aquino, Noynoy Aquino, becomes president. And we seem to have this idea of, these good reformists fighting against the problems of this corrupt Marcos dictatorship and continuing to undertake reforms for decades. This ultimately, for reasons that I can't go into in detail here, is seen as a failure. I agree with Adele, it's an institutional failure. It was a failure, but also because although economic was restored, as most of you will know, Marcos Sr. left behind an economic disaster, despite the recent nostalgia for his presidency. Growth was restored, but it wasn't widely distributed, and poverty remains very high in the Philippines. Depends how you count it, but more than half of Filipinos will tell pollsters that they are poor. Also, Estrada's populism, which Adele talked about, which could be called, say, proletarian populism, that was undermined, and there were a number of other political figures, one who ran against Macapagal Arroyo, who I mentioned, another movie star, Fernando Poe Jr. He was cheated in 2004. And a third still, another mayor of Makati, this business district in Manila, Binay, he was a major candidate until Aquino allies undermined him through what can be seen as a selective Senate investigation. So there was this alternative, this pro-poor kind of rhetoric. One could talk about how serious it was, but it was certainly less deadly than the Duterte populism that emerges to fill this vacuum. Duterte uses a similarly repressive repertoire in his failed pandemic response, which can be called brute force governance, shielding him from responsibility and accountability, deflecting from his obvious governance failures, and demonstrating how effective it is as a legitimation strategy. Another interesting point I want to mention briefly is Duterte's claim to be a socialist, despite harming the poor through the drug war, through not changing the Philippines' economic model that did little to help the poor. He had said he would be the country's first socialist president. He started negotiations with the Communist Party when he took office. He had friendly relations when he was mayor, but later declares them terrorists, resumes extrajudicial killings against the left, and did not undertake major socioeconomic reforms. Did use anti-oligarchic rhetoric, but this primarily served to benefit his cronies. Rather, what you can see is Duterte was claiming drugs are the source of our poverty, and if we can just eradicate them, we can fix this place. which deflects attention from the death of development with, as I said, poverty levels high despite decades of high growth. And this strategy of securitization, brute force governance, is also employed during the pandemic, again, undermining accountability in a weak state with poor record of human development. And this is where I impinge a bit on what Jean is undoubtedly going to be talking about. Duterte is a macho populist. His misogyny, his hyper-masculine displays that are seen to demonstrate his authenticity, particularly against the hypocrisy of this old liberal reformist elite. And it's important to point out that 4 of the leading oppositionists to Duterte were women, and he went after them very harshly. The first, Senator De Lima, was slut-shamed after she held hearings about his drug war. She had committed the dual gender and class sin of sleeping with her driver, and she's still jailed to this day on trumped-up drug charges. Duterte fired his vice president, separately elected in the Philippines, from the cabinet after she criticized the drug war. Maria Ressa, who everybody will know, is the Nobel Prize winner. She still faces a number of legal issues, cyber libel cases they're called, clearly initiated by the Duterte administration against her and others to intimidate the media. And Chief Justice Maria Sereno removed after defending justices tagged for drugs by Duterte. And I want to briefly talk about this issue of illiberality. And there's been a lot of discussion in the literature about how widespread anti-pluralist views are in the Philippines, support for a strong leader who gets things done, unhindered by constraints. If you ask that kind of leading question, many Filipinos will agree. What Paul and Ronald Holmes have pointed out, that this may in fact show support for illiberal policies, not liberalism generally, the popularity of the drug war. But of course, this does prove this point about, despite his democratic legitimacy, this massive violation of human rights. It also seems to fit to this theory of a famous Philippine political scientist, Agpalo, who talks about the preference of Filipinos for strong terms, and would also help explain this nostalgia for the Marcos dictatorship that helped his son recently win the 2022 election, and why Cory Aquino is now seen as this weak president. But interestingly, in his writings, Agpalo did admit that Rizal stood for a liberal tradition, and Jose Rizal, as most of you I think will know, is the national hero of the Philippines, recently the subject of an interesting biography which puts him in this liberal context by Lelo Claudio, that there is this strong liberal tradition. And of course, Cory Aquino once unseated Marcos Sr., suggesting that the current illiberalism is indeed situational. And we have to explain why the illiberalism now, not kind of an essentialist, oh, Filipinos are illiberal. And we also do see, even if it's not a coherent opposition movement, I would agree with that, you do see strong anti-drug and then later anti-terrorism protests in the Philippines. And you see massive youth mobilization, albeit for a losing campaign for the Vice President Robredo, who campaigned against Marcos Jr. losing in 2022. Okay, so to conclude, it's important to perhaps mention that Duterte was ahead of this illiberal populist curve, elected a few months before Trump and a year or so before Bolsonaro. There are similar social media ills to be looked at. Facebook, in fact, a Facebook executive spoke about this, and one reason why Philippines has been identified as patient zero in Facebook disinformation. Of course, Cambridge Analytica was also involved in the Philippines before it got involved in Trump's election and others. Illiberalism seems to be persisting under Duterte's successor, Marcos Jr., although the footnote is Duterte's illiberal realignment toward China is now being reassessed by Marcos Jr. under pressure from the US, perhaps also the military and public opinion. So that's an interesting shift. But I think the main takeaway here is the Philippines being an extreme example of this populist dichotomy of the good people and criminal others used to legitimate mass killings. It's a highly militarized brute force governance that we see in Duterte's rule, in a democratically legitimated but highly illiberal leader who blames ne'er-do-wells for complex social problems facing the country, and which deflects from mass poverty by what Bello has called a fascist original. That's the fascist word, whether we want to talk about that. Bello is the one who brought it into the Philippine discussion. However, the current dominance of illiberalism in Philippine politics has been met by considerable, if not entirely coherent, liberal pushback, which goes back to a century-old tradition of Rizal and the independence movement more generally. So I'll stop with that and look forward to the discussion.
I think I'm next. Okay, so good afternoon from a very warm and humid Manila. Can you see my presentation? Okay. Sorry also for my hoarse voice. So today I will talk about Duterte's gendered populism and hypermasculinity. I will talk about populism, gender, and international migration, Duterte as a populist, and the history, a brief background of Philippine out-migration, Duterte's gendered rhetoric towards migrants, and some concluding remarks. The literature on populism says that there has been a lot of studies linking gender and populism, and in fact, it has been expanding. I actually draw from Saresma, who coins the term gender populism to refer to a simplifying understanding of gender as a natural, essentially dichotomous order based on positioning both women and men in hierarchical locations in terms of power. The literature on gender populism and migration actually has a Eurocentric bias, as what Mark referred to a while ago about populist studies in general. And if they talk about international migration, they usually, of course, refer to host states. And the usual strategy would be for populists to engage in racism and othering of immigrants, coupled with criticism of feminism and privileging the traditional family as a way to sort of protect them from the othered immigrants. The argument of some in defending why gender and migration has become very prominent in Europe is that immigration has been such a crisis in most countries in Europe. But actually, in the global south, particularly in the Philippines, Philippine labor out migration actually also has a lot of history of crisis situation in which the government has to break, for instance, its relations with the Coalition of the Willing, for instance, in 2004, when a migrant was kidnapped in Iraq, in 1995, when a migrant worker who was a domestic worker was murdered by Singapore. We filed by the Singaporean government, we filed a diplomatic protest. So it in fact also is very crisis prone. In looking at migration and Duterte's gendered rhetoric, I actually use Moffitt's definition of populism as a political style. So my question is basically, why is Duterte popular with Filipinos overseas? Well, in fact, Duterte garnered 70% of the vote in 2016 among Filipinos overseas. We since 2004, we have allowed our overseas migrants, for as long as they are still Filipino citizens, to vote. His candidacy, in fact, increased by 30% the overseas votes, which generally has not been significant in terms of contribution to the overall voter turnout. A lot of overseas Filipinos actually campaigned for Duterte and even volunteered to his campaign, but I trace their support and their fanaticism for Duterte when in 2015, I think a month or weeks before Duterte declared his candidacy, the issue of bullet planting in the airports became very, very prominent and widely covered by the media. In that incident, a lot of migrant workers were actually victimized because the worst thing that you can do to a Filipino migrant worker is to derail his or her plans to travel abroad. A lot of media entities actually covered Duterte's reaction, hyper-masculine reaction. In fact, he was quoted as, "If you are in Davao, I will kill you all," in referring to the perpetrators. "If I were president, you would all be exterminated. I will order your execution within 48 hours. In contrast to the very stoic reaction of President Benigno Aquino III at that time. In fact, Duterte volunteered to be the lawyer for overseas Filipinos who were victimized at that time. The context of Philippine labor out-migration is such that since 1974, the government has been involved in labor export. I call it labor export through the labor code, which actually institutionalized overseas employment. Today, more than 12 million Filipinos abroad. People say that it is this data is severely underreported in more than 200 countries and territories around the world. So there are lots of Filipinos everywhere. It has consistently been the fourth largest remittance recipient country in the world. In 2022 alone, there is the Filipinos abroad remitted $38 billion to the Philippines. A key characteristic of overseas migration is the feminization of migration, in which not only is 60% of Filipino migrants comprised by women, a lot of Filipino migrants are also in so-called feminized jobs, domestic workers and caregivers and nurses. Migration scholars also refer to the government as paternalist in terms of viewing Filipino migrant women. There are stricter regulation for women migrants' mobilities compared to men. Deployment bans on domestic workers. 9 out of 10 are domestic workers, are women. Is very much a usual part of governing migration. But there's also a huge bureaucracy to cater to Filipino migrants' needs. But in all these history, rhetoric, and bureaucratic practices, bureaucratic language has always been used. No, but Duterte is different. I look at a case study of his presidential visit to South Korea in 2018, where he had a 3-hour speech. The usual case is that a Philippine president would visit Filipino communities comprising migrant workers and Filipino residents, but Duterte's speech would have rock star reception from migrant Filipinos. Usually jam-packed rooms. It's usually a very long speech, but this particular speech of Duterte was made headlines around the world because he kissed a migrant Filipino woman on the lips. So I looked at Duterte's speech, that 3-hour speech, the transcript, and I looked at his tropes, what are the themes that comprised his speech. And one is that of a protective and angry father. In his speech, he said that he will protect anyone from destroying my country. And he framed this in a way that makes sense to Filipinos abroad by emphasizing that their children's welfare is his priority. In his words, and how many Filipinos are suffering outside just to earn a living so that they can send money back home. So you can imagine that this resonates very well to migrant Filipinos abroad. And in a sense, it justifies violence against fellow Filipinos as extremely necessary. So that's just one of a sample of his rhetoric, no? As a migrant, as a protective and angry father. Next would be a Filipino everyman. No, he was usually dressed in ordinary clothes, not really in a very formal attire. He would use humor. People who study rhetoric of populists would look at humor as a very, very powerful. In fact, in this particular speech in South Korea, he admitted to having two wives. But he had to segue in a way that will, make this moral transgression excusable by saying that there is no such thing as a first family. We are all first family. We are all workers of the government working for the Filipino people. So this is very very symbolic and would certainly resonate very well with Filipino migrants, because in this rhetoric, they would feel that they're really part of the nation, that their president really cares for them, and that they don't mind whether he has two wives. They also don't mind whether this is some form of a double standard, given that he has, as Mark Thompson said a while ago, given that he also accused legislator Senator Laila De Lima of committing adultery. Tropes of the speech, the last trope of the speech that I unraveled would be, he's also a ladies' man. He, of course, he justified that he asked permission, that he wanted to kiss the migrant woman. In fact, he also asked whether the migrant woman had a husband, but he couched this as something that's ordinary, and that these people also said that it was just for the enjoyment. It was part of Filipino culture. So I looked at this and draw from Mendonca and Cayetano, who studied Bolsonaro, and says that this is something that's common, because and that this ladies' man approach is something that the base of these populists would not mind, mainly because it gives new meaning to the authority of the office. No, the mere fact that Duterte had to say this in front of the presidential rostrum, presidential seal, is a denial of its standard forms. It means that Duterte is really, quote unquote, one with the people. So it makes it a very, very powerful speech. And my sense in my argument, the reaction from the Duterte camp further amplifies and sort of forgives Duterte, because they see it as a joke and a part of Filipino culture. When you say that it is a joke, then it erases or it closes any apology, and apology is not needed, and it erases or closes any form of resistance, because it's merely a joke, no? And the fact that women were also laughing, as I watched in the video also, and there were also women cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries from the camp of Duterte who forgave Duterte, who did not mind what Duterte did. It's something that feminist scholars would say as compliance to patriarchy. But what does this make of Duterte's behavior? It forgives the perpetrator. That's actually the one thing that can be said about this type of reaction. The other thing that I observed was that even legislators, when they say that it's an assault and abuse of power, rightfully so, but when they invoke that the Philippines already has a good record, and true enough, in terms of gender equality laws and programs, they actually individualize Duterte's actions and rhetoric. They look at it as something that's not societal. It pathologizes Duterte's tendency to be misogynist and sexist, and therefore they tend to frame Duterte's action, rhetoric, and practice as as an individual issue rather than a societal and systemic issue. So in effect, that tells you that it closes resistance, no? And more than anything else, it tells us why Duterte's speech and his rhetoric among migrants is very powerful, because it's not very different. It's quite different from the usual state migration. It resonates, or it veers from the usual bureaucratic language that the state employs. No, the state is very much involved in catering to every migrant's needs, from pre-employment to repatriation. But when in doing so, the state uses bureaucratic or legalist rhetoric. But in Duterte's case, he's very much personalized, as mentioned a while ago. But it's also very very personalized rather than very bureaucratic. And also, I interpret the case as embodying masculine entitlement that is not inherently different from deployment bans and stricter regulations for migrant Filipino women. In saying that it was merely a joke, Duterte was saying that I own this migrant Filipino woman anyway, so I have the right to kiss her. And in a sense, that tells you why Duterte's populist style is very popular, resonates very well to people from all walks of life, and in a way suggests why it stifles resistance, no? Because even those who oppose him subscribes to language or rhetoric that actually supports his rhetoric style among migrants, and even to ordinary Filipinos. That's it. Thank you very much.
Jeff? Okay.
Sure, yeah. Oops. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So first, thanks to the ECPS for this very timely event. Yeah, and I'm honored to be part of this panel, sharing this panel with esteemed colleagues whose works are really valuable to my personal work on media and populism. So my presentation today is about media populism and the way the mediated expression of populism on Facebook impacts the sorry state of free speech in Rodrigo Duterte's Philippines, who served as the Philippine president from 2016 to 2022. So there are lively debates about free speech or the lack thereof in many societies, including discussions on hate speech and extreme speech. I hope you don't mind if I used a more modest approach to my presentation today and stick for now to what I call anti-free speech. I will argue that part of the political legacy of the Duterte administration is anti-free speech that characterizes a complicated hybrid of hateful, banal, and light rhetoric that bridge the putative relational ties of the leader and his idealized publics. I hope to show in this presentation how Duterte's anti-free speech thrives within the climate of network disinformation and, to some extent, affective and emotional politics that collectively spoil the civil consensus on free speech and political participation. So I use the case of the Philippines, a Southeast Asian nation of over 75 million Facebook users and regarded as the social media capital of the world. While the country prides itself as, I would say once, a bastion of free speech and democratic movement in the region, the Philippines under the Duterte administration, which ended in mid-2022 last year, recorded major pushbacks against such areas as rule of law, civil liberties, free expression, and press freedom. Since 2018, up to this writing, the Philippines has been classified as an electoral autocracy, meaning that while the country observes multi-party elections, there are insufficient levels of rights in areas like right to suffrage and free expression, according to the 2023 report of the VDEM Institute. The classification of electoral autocracy is a downgrade from what the country used to be prior to the Duterte era, that is electoral democracy, where there are relatively free and fair multi-party elections and satisfactory degrees of rights. The country's state of press freedom, once regarded as the freest in Southeast Asia, recorded yearly decline from 2017 to 2022 under Duterte, placing the country from 127 to 147th spot. This is among 180 or so countries and territories, according to Reporters Without Borders. So there are certainly many factors, old, systemic, emerging, and even hybridized factors that contributed to this democratic backsliding, and that such a crisis, if I may, is transnational and global in character, which forces us to reevaluate some of the ways we approach the features of contemporary politics and digital politics in particular. The concept of populism is understood in many ways, and I'm glad that my colleagues in this panel offer some of the authoritative voices about this subject. While elusive and recurrent as a concept, the key characters of populism, especially the notion of the people, quote unquote, are evident in many societies across geographical lines. Some scholars of populism explain that the core element of the term is to speak and act in the name of the people, broadly defined, and that this act of representing the people by the leader can be manipulated to construct political identities and political conflicts. I share this observation, although in this presentation, I would limit my work using an understanding of populism as a political communication style that uses certain rhetoric, identity, and media to connect with the people. For instance, the disenchanted or the aggrieved groups, while it also aggravates the other, like the center ground elite or the establishment. This understanding would allow me to highlight the centrality of rhetoric and style in the communicative expression of mediated populism. In terms of its relationship with disinformation, populism is central, if not intrinsic, to the network information, or what some call digital propaganda. The multifaceted practices associated with disinformation come in different forms, like political trolling and digital black ops in the Philippines, the digital practices of fact-checking and online aggression linked to the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, the use of buzzers or netizens paid by commercial companies to promote politicians in Indonesia, and as well as the narrative of Christian white nationalism in the US. A cursory look at recent studies on free speech under contemporary populism would show a variety of speeches or brands of speeches used by populist actors. In Duterte's Philippines, the prominent kind is that of hate speech, which aptly describes the leader's hostility against the political opposition, including human rights activists, church leaders, and politicians, opposing the brutal war on drugs. Duterte's open hostility against the dominant centuries-old Catholic Church and its teachings, something past Philippine presidents didn't bother to do, is a clear expression of hate speech that dehumanizes and incites discrimination against the perceived other. In Narendra Modi's India, for instance, there's a lively interrogation into the simplistic divide associated with hate or bad speech versus good speech. So some scholars call it extreme speech that broadens the hostile character of hate speech to include culture-specific practices and sentiments that resonate with the expressions of the digital publics. This includes such expressions as rumors and humors that connect with the imaginations of some segments of the publics. Anti-free speech in Duterte's Philippines is represented by hateful, banal, and light rhetoric that target and appeal to different segments of the publics. In this presentation, I only focus on three ways or three narratives deployed under the Duterte administration. So namely, first is the homogenization of the political opposition. Second is the appeal to the notion of family. And third is the appeal to the notion of religion. So on your screen is the former president showing some of the reported alleged drug users, members of drug syndicates in public. So amplifying the label of terrorism, so this is the first narrative, the Duterte diehard supporters, or more popularly known as the DDS, orchestrates the supposed anti-elite and nationalist rhetoric of Duterte. DDS is a mobilized yet highly unstructured coalition of individuals and networks that maintain an active presence online, especially on Facebook and YouTube. On YouTube, for instance, it's no less than the national government's channel, People's Television Network, that reports on how DDS members worldwide are gathering to express their continued support for Duterte, whose life, according to his supporters, is endangered by the elite. So the DDS uses the rhetoric of Dilawan, or the color yellow. So this yellow color is a political color associated with another political family, another political clan, to target the perceived other. Although the opposition color of yellow is not as accurate as the DDS would have one believed, Duterte and his incendiary social media armies were able to signify yellow with political opposition marked with elitism, incompetence, and bogus sense of nationalism. The second narrative is about the populist notion of family, which shows how the strongman, yet compassionate brand of leadership of Duterte is capable of securing the welfare of family, children, and of future generations. On Facebook, the leader was melodramatically revered as quote-unquote father of the nation, showing how he managed to spend quality time with family and children despite his political career. For his online supporters, Duterte epitomized a strong brand of leadership that can bring back the long-gone discipline expected of every Filipino, a leadership brand that is humane enough to protect the law-abiding populace. In this photo, we can see a certain pro-Duterte Facebook page promoting the caring image of the leader, notwithstanding the leader's crass remarks against women, the clergy, local politicians, and journalists. And the third notion is about the notion or the populist notion of religion, which highlights the devout identity of the leader through practices and identification with recognized symbols of faith, such as kneeling and praying, showing images of processions, being prayed over by leaders of different churches, although these leaders come predominantly from the prominent Catholic faith, and expressions of prayers and aspirations. The religion-related posts conflate facts and fictitious accounts to magnify the pious image of Duterte. So in this image, it shows an edited photo of Duterte kneeling and praying with a comment asking for God's protection of Duterte. Posts by other pro-Duterte Facebook pages would also claim that the leader was indeed a gift from God to the Philippines. So I hope to have demonstrated the complicated mix of hateful, banal, and light sentiments that target the aspirations of the digital publics. The Philippine case showed how we can expand the belligerence and strict binarism typical of political populism. Features that, while central to contemporary populism, may not fully account for the sophisticated terms of populism and contemporary digital politics at large. Under the new administration of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, the anti-free speech honed by the previous administration presents real-world dangers to this day. Duterte continues to exhibit closer ties with the church leader, Apollo Kibuloy, who is in the wanted list of the US Federal Bureau of Investigation for crimes including sex trafficking of children and case smuggling. The church leader's media, they call it the Sunshine Media Network International, serves as one of the primary media platforms of Duterte and his supporters to attack the quote-unquote other, including independent media outlets and legitimate foreign bodies like the International Criminal Court. In the area of legislation, some of Duterte's close allies in both houses of Congress, we call it the Senate and the House of Representatives, relentlessly advocate pro-Duterte policies like shielding the leader from investigations into his bloody drug war. Just recently, some lawmakers proposed to upgrade the financial benefits of former living presidents, citing solely the case of Duterte. So what we are seeing then is the changing terms of mediated populism that can reformat the civil consensus on free speech, one that can disrupt and even redefine our sense of political participation in the digital sphere. We thus need to be more attentive to the innovative terms of mediated populism so we can better address the rhetorical, digital, and real-world challenges of anti-free speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thanks also to Jean, Mark, and Adele as well. So as Teresa mentioned at the start of the program, we're happy to take questions either by putting them in the chat and I can read them out, or preferably you can raise your hand and I will then give the podium to you and you can ask your questions directly. So I'll open it up for a minute to see if there are any hands raised or anyone who wants to come in and pose a question to one of our panelists tonight.
Paul Selçuk Gültaşlı. Could you see?
Let me see. I'm trying to just open my chat here. Hang on. Sorry, participant. So I have Selçuk. Is that right?
Thank you all.
You can automatically speak. You can. Great. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you all for the fascinating presentations. They were very insightful indeed. I want to ask Professor Webb, you mentioned about the US legacy in the Philippines, the colonial legacy. What role did it play in the rise of populist movement in the Philippines and the rise of President Duterte in particular? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Should I answer now, Paul, or do you want to keep collecting questions?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, thanks for your question. Obviously, that's if we had 2 hours, would happily talk to you about that. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that a sort of terrain that is resonant for populism doesn't come out of nowhere. And certainly we need to kind of look for reasons that anxieties and emotions can get triggered by populist ideologies and discourses and so on. And in the work that I've done, I've sort of traced back to that colonial period, which actually lasted for over 4 decades, the first half of the 20th century in the Philippines, as a source of kind of like democratic paradox. So if we're talking about the paradox of democracy, then this really epitomized it, because the Americans kind of invaded, took over the revolutionary movement in the name of democracy and in the name of liberation, and in the name of kind of benevolent imperialism, and then began very slowly to build institutions of representative democracy that were so muted and hamstrung that even the politicians in the first decade of that were saying, you know, you're damaging the idea of representative democracy in the Philippines, because we can't represent the people that you've made us this House of Representatives, but you actually told us we can't represent them. So you're damaging the idea of representative democracy in the Philippines. And you know, the story of the political elite in the Philippines is a messy and co-opted one. They certainly are not the heroes of the story, but certainly at the beginning they were trying to say, you know, this is not the way to begin the process to build a democracy. So there's a connection there, and then in terms of institutions, but I guess the connection that I've been more interested in is in terms of sentiments of voters, and why people will imagine that a certain type of leadership is tolerable and in fact even legitimate in order to achieve, you know, good outcomes. And that period of half a century really, you know, was a lesson in basically don't rock the boat, be a unified nation, don't protest, don't be disruptive, don't be oppositional, and then you can have independence and democracy. You know, I'm, as a kind of historically minded scholar, I'm of the belief that those sort of long-term lessons in political learning and political socialization, they don't disappear once the colonial period ends. They traverse the boundaries that we want to draw around history to say that was over and now we're in the post-independence era and therefore none of that matters anymore. Well, that in the studies of kind of how people think, in attitudes and emotions, in lingering anxieties, in resonant narratives, that's not true. So in short, the colonial history, I would say, has a lot to do with why certain features of the political landscape have remained, and those features happen to be some things that are very suitable to populist politics.
Could I add something to that, Paul? Is that all right if I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to underline the point about the co-optation of liberalism. You know, I mentioned Jose Rizal, and that's also an interesting study of how Jose Rizal's ideas are kind of taken by the American colonizers. And of course, you know, Rizal is a genuine hero. He's genuinely revered, but, you know, he somehow also gets utilized in the American colonial project. And then we can also add, you know, how in the 1950s, after, you know, independence, the U.S. starts intervening covertly, the 1950s, with this president named Ramon Magsaysay against communism, but also in the name of democracy, supporting martial law, Reagan backing Marcos to the bitter end, but then enough people in the State Department changing their minds so that there's this discussion of how the U.S. was actually part of the, at least part of the U.S. Government as part of the overthrow strategy. So, and that's, when Duterte talks about nationalism and so on, that's a genuine issue of the unfinished revolution in Philippine history. So I think that's a fair point. Two others, I mentioned the transgressing presidents, Quezon, the Commonwealth president, Marcos, the martial law president, but there was also before him the Governor General Leonard Wood, who transgressed his authority. So again, an interesting colonial president. And finally, people talk a lot about the failure of social reform in the Philippines, particularly land reform, but one shouldn't forget the first failed land reform was by the Americans under Taft. And so that set the precedent for the inability to deal with inequalities in Philippine society. And that precedent was unfortunately very strong, and subsequent land reform programs also were very limited or even failed.
Thanks, Mark. Another question back to yourself and Adele, and to anyone else who wants to address this issue. But Matteo has a question about the effect that Duterte's populism has on his choices in foreign policy, especially with respect to China. So, Mark, while you have the floor, do you want to respond first, and then Adele?
Yeah, thanks. Just quickly, my point there would be his illiberal realignment. So I think Duterte's nationalism is genuine. I don't think people doubt that. Why he doesn't like the U.S. viscerally is an interesting issue, which there's been some speculation about, involves some personal issues as well. But clearly, he also had some, also his education. He had, one of his teachers, interestingly, was the head of the Communist Party until he died late last year. So he had this genuine nationalist sentiment. But in addition, of course, with his drug war, with the criticism of the Obama administration, although much friendlier reaction from Trump, and a nice meeting with Trump where they sang, Duterte sang for Trump. So, but he saw the policy of moving toward China as helpful in dealing with this Western criticism for the U.S. and the EU in particular. So Marcos Jr. has been moving away from that, interestingly, but I think I see that as the major shift under Duterte. One could talk a little bit about why that didn't succeed even in the late Duterte administration. There was a move away from that. There's a sense that China hadn't really given the Philippines much in return, particularly in South China Sea, called the West Philippine Sea in the Philippines, or in terms of major investments.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think this is a really interesting case in which to consider the differences between rhetoric and material kind of policy, because, his rhetoric on pivoting toward China and completely denouncing the relationship between the Philippines and the United States was very performative. It was very resonant. It increased his popularity. It made people feel like he was the defender of the, the formerly colonized Filipino people who are still, as Mark said, searching for the revolutionary break with the past. So he knew that. He's not the first president to know that. In fact, all of them basically play that revolutionary nationalism card. It doesn't make it particularly, distinguishable as an element of populism in that case, I think, or at least it doesn't make it distinguishable in the Philippines. But what's interesting is that, as Mark mentioned, in the late period of his administration, whether due to provision of vaccines from the United States, COVID vaccines, or other kind of factors that were influencing him, he was persuaded to basically not renege on agreements that he had previously said very confidently that he was going to renege on. So in one sense, this shows us some integrity of institutions that were able to kind of steer him back from the cliff of kind of walking fully over the cliff with the relationship with the United States. But I think, I'm not an IR scholar, but I think IR scholars would call it a case of hedging your bets. And I think in the Philippines has been doing that and continues to do that in terms of its foreign policy. The populism just kind of plays up the performative side of the foreign policy, but doesn't necessarily change in the long term the direction of the policy.
Thanks, Adele and Mark. So yeah, I think there's a kind of distinct sort of pragmatism about Duterte's populism, and it's quite evident when it comes to foreign policy, where he did very much track back, as Mark mentioned, in the second half of his administration. There's another interesting question, this time on the role of macho culture and the silence of individuals, how much this contributes to the rise of violent populism, and reciprocally then, what turn civil disobedience can play in challenging and disrupting such dangerous political movements. Jean, I don't know if you would like to come in first on that question, but anyone else is welcome to speak to it too.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for the one who asked the question. I think the macho culture really contributed to the violent populism, mainly because I don't know if you've come across the World Value Survey. There's a question there in which majority of Filipinos say that they'd like, what do you call this? Men make better political leaders compared to women. And so earlier there was this discussion whether people fear Duterte or not. But I guess based on surveys, we can also say that there are preferences and attitudes of Filipinos that lend itself to the kind of leadership that Duterte instituted during his administration. For instance, drug addiction is very much stigmatized in the Philippines across classes. So it makes sense to them that, drug addicts are killed, because that's the only way to what do you call this, to stop the things that they do, as which most Filipinos would say would be immoral. In the World Value Survey, for instance, there's a question about who would you like to be your neighbor? Drug addicts rank high as among the people that most Filipinos would not want to have as their neighbor. So, and pop culture, Filipino pop culture has actually demonized drug addicts, such as it's very commonsensical for Filipinos to look at drug addiction as something immoral rather than a health problem. Yeah. And the fact that Duterte acted violently against them, it serves his macho image, and it also reinforced what Filipinos would like to see in their leaders, at least according to these surveys.
Thanks very much. And I was also just wondering, does anyone want to respond to the other part of the question in terms of resistance, especially civil disobedience, with respect to the regime?
Yeah, well, Paul, let me just pick up on the gender issue. And I think the favorite word in this panel has become paradox, right? So there's another paradox here, because in terms of, there are various surveys that have been done on gender equality, and the Philippines actually ranks very highly in a number of categories. And let's not forget, they've had two Philippine female presidentas, we could say. Cory Aquino, I mentioned, and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the current vice president, is a woman. So, and you look across Philippine society, and the role of women is very prominent. You could maybe make the more cynical argument where it really counts in big business and so on, perhaps less so. But, compared to a lot of other societies in the region in particular, it looks pretty good. Nonetheless, as Jean has been talking about, and I mentioned in passing, there is this macho image which Duterte played into, part of his demeanor, his joking, and it had these deadly consequences, as Jean was mentioning, in terms of demonizing drug dealers. So we got a paradox here to unpack, and there's a lot to do in that regard. In terms of the civil disobedience, so I've been looking at the protests against Duterte, and they were quite substantial on 3 occasions. Against the Marcos burial, this is again back to the dictator Marcos. Very early in the Duterte presidency, President Duterte got money from the Marcoses to run for president. He, by the way, won not overwhelmingly, but a plurality in a multi-candidate election. His major plurality comes shortly thereafter. So he feels, indebted to the Marcoses. He gives them the hero's burial that they've been demanding, and was refused by these earlier presidents. Then the second was when a young man, 17-year-old, is killed by the police, has nothing to do with drugs. He's an honors student, and he's captured on CCTV just being led away and executed by the police. That leads to huge protests in 2017. Catholic Church is involved, NGOs are involved. There's a major protest movement. It does decline shortly thereafter. Duterte meets with the family, and the appeal of the drug war is just such that, Duterte says, look, bad apples here, bad cops, they got indicted. They're still not been convicted. Their appeals of their conviction are still ongoing. Their superiors, of course, never hold in front of the judges. And then the third major protests were against the anti-terrorism law, which we talked about in passing, where Duterte pivots and starts demonizing the left, which he'd previously been negotiating with. So you do see this movement, and it has its moments. The protests are there, and as I said, there's also the mobilization during Robredo, another female candidate, we should add, who was demonized along misogynist lines, one should add. So there's signs of life in the opposition, but they haven't yet come together and presented a very strong alternative. And that's clear in the 2022 landslide victory for Marcos Jr.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll come on to the next question from Srijan. So to summarize this question from the chat, Duterte is part of this general rise of populism, but he doesn't appear to be like other so-called right-wing populists, among those, Bolsonaro, Trump, Erdogan, and so on, in that he doesn't appear to have this very obvious other of a racial, religious, or ethnic minority, nor even a liberal elite that he demonizes as an other. So how is it that Duterte formulates his idea of a people and an other, given that he doesn't conform to these sort of usual dichotomies? Does anyone want to respond to that question?
I'm happy to have a go and then pass the baton, so to speak. It's a really interesting question. There's a lot to pick up on there, but a few things. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about applying this kind of frame of this concept or term of populism to the Philippines. A lot of the things that are just being kind of demystified, even about populism in Europe, that it has to be left or right wing, that it's attached to a particular ideology and agenda, and that it's sort of not mainstream, that it's always on the outside of the political system. I mean, those things are being debunked only now in terms of the application of the term populism to kind of European cases. In the Philippines, they make really no sense whatsoever. So talking about left-wing and right-wing populism, I understand where that comes from, but it doesn't make much sense in the Philippine landscape, where you don't have partisan politics based on left and right kind of programmatic kind of agendas. So, and the point that I was trying to make is that you have to then, if you want to be a populist, you have to then cultivate, or in your words, in the words of the questioner, cultivate this idea of the people using other means. And I think what is really interesting about the case of the Philippines is that rather than kind of doing that through deeply polarizing rhetoric and narratives, often case, and Duterte is the same, as this, you use actually ideas of a unified people. You obviously have to have a division, you have to have the other, but the other is really, it's not a serious other, it's not an opposition other, it's not a counter idea other, it's just some other that lies outside of the unified Philippine people, and therefore everyone can imagine themselves within that group of unified Filipino people. And not many people imagine themselves as the other. Whereas in the case of, populism in Europe and right-wing populism, you have genuine kind of opposition blocks. You have anti-populist blocks. You have liberal elites who are, saying we need to protect institutions. We have to, go back to the rule of law and so on. You don't have that to the same, in the same way in the Philippines. And that's why, I think, the populist actors, they draw on resonant historical narratives and so on in order to perform their populist kind of politics. Let me pass it on to someone else.
Yeah. Let me just add something. I think this is one area where the formidable strength of social media in particular comes in. Yeah. So I think Mark mentioned this a while ago. During the election days of Duterte in 2016, the Philippines was considered a patient zero. So even before the electoral rise rather of Trump, as well as the issue on Brexit dominated the news headlines, many of the entrepreneurial work and some of our colleagues working on network disinformation would actually show that it's not really ideological perspectives that motivate this workers and entrepreneurs, so-called entrepreneurs, for disinformation, but really more on the labor work. Yeah. And there are some interesting areas as well in how the disinformation platform under the new administration of Marcos and Sara Duterte to take note of. Yeah.
Just briefly, Paul, if I can add, so my comment would be, so he others the ne'er-do-wells. These are the interesting in the Philippines, often called standby, those who just stand by. These people on the corner with dirty T-shirts, young men generally, drinking too much, taking drugs, causing trouble, staying up late. And then during the pandemic, they were called pasaway, the hard-headed, those who wouldn't follow the rules, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of the lumpen proletariat, if you want to use Marxist terms. And it's a disciplining act. It's getting people to follow the rules, and that's why you can have this unifying rhetoric, because it's just if those who misbehave would just get in line, then the rest of us who are good people, we could get on with our business. And the second point I want to again mention is, so this can be understood, and the reason it's so distinct in the Philippine case is it comes from this local experience. He's a boss. He's a political boss of Davao. He's mayor there. His succeeded by his daughter. It takes over again, this rotating thing because of term limits. And there he develops this neo-Baucis model where he knows that drugs are the way to become popular, and he can get between these competing factions with the far left and the military and so on. So he's got this strategy ready, just nationalize it. That's very distinctive. But it does change at the end of his presidency. So when he does this red tagging, it's called, when he turns against the left, he also starts tagging regular, quote unquote, regular, more moderate oppositionists. And that's where, interestingly, you start getting a more coherent opposition to emerge, because it's not just, these people who just cause trouble on the margins, the ruffians. It's regular oppositionists as well, and they're better organized and so on. So you do see this emergence. And by the way, women play a big role. I mentioned Robredo, I mentioned De Lima, I mentioned Maria Ressa, and Sereno, the Supreme Court Justice. We should also mention Risa Ontiveros, the only real oppositionist in the Senate. So women play a big role in this pushback. But I think one thing Marcos Jr. has done is very interesting maneuver, is to talk about unity and not attack the opposition like Duterte did toward the end of his rule, and trying to hold off a kind of nascent polarization that seemed to be starting at the end of Duterte's administration.
Thanks, Mark. And Bülent, I'll go to you for the last question. If he's there, Bülent.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for these interesting presentations and insightful discussions. My question is not about the past and the present, but about the future, because we know that Trump went, but Trumpism is still alive. And we know that Chavez died, but still Chavismo is effective in Venezuela. And we know that Bolsonaro lost the elections, defeated, but Bolsonarism is still alive. What will the fate of Dutertismo? It will continue to affect in its old framework, try to continue to affect Philippines politics. This is the one part of my question. The other part of the question is that I had a perception that Philippines politics monopolized by certain families, and there is just a circulation of the power of these families. And the Duterte may be a newcomer, but still we see his family became effective, like Bonbon Marcos and now Sara Duterte, maybe another Duterte next time. What do you think about that? These questions for Jeff and Jean. Thank you.
Jeff, would you like to respond first?
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. So, well, I don't have a magic ball in front of me, but what I can say is, I think, just in relation to the earlier question on the question of possibilities, yeah, are there ways to address this vicious and hostile populism legacy of Duterte under Marcos and another Duterte in office? This is a hard sell, but I think media and information literacy would play a central role in these kinds of movement and resistance. Specifically, I think the ongoing initiatives on fact-checking. So one potential of this, of course, this is a modest approach, but I think one potential of this fact-checking initiatives is network and collaborative efforts among different sectors, among journalists, academe, the church, and even other human rights and civil society organizations. Yeah. So I think that's one thing that we can look at in terms of how can we possibly resist this temptations and I would say continuous flirtations with populist sentiments.
Well, in my case, I guess it's time to explore proposals for a law against violence against women in politics. And when I say violence, it's not just murdering women candidates or media personnel, but it's also about, maligning them or engaging in disinformation, especially gender disinformation. I guess this is something that could be explored, could be started to be talked about among politicians in the Philippines. But the thing is, who will lead it? No, because we cannot see another Laila de Lima again. No, we cannot afford to have another Laila de Lima again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we're just about coming to the close in terms of time. And Bulent, I think I'll just sort of allow myself one more minute to respond to your question before I pass over to Teresa. And one of the things that we haven't talked about a great deal are political parties. And if we think about populism in some way as the polar opposite of that, as a way of winning and keeping power, this idea of personalistic, direct, media-based appeals to the people, whatever the rhetorical content, but the basic form or the strategy tends to be the same with populists. The opposite being political parties who organize the people, who have these reciprocal bottom-up and top-down structures that can filter public opinion and sort of inhibit this kind of big swings in public opinion. For instance, we see that law and order and these issues of crime escalate to the top of the agenda before Duterte actually runs for president. So he kind of, hits this zeitgeist. But, ideally, when you have political parties, some of this sort of kind of whipsawing of public opinion gets sort of filtered out in representative democracy. So representative democracy is not as responsive, but in some ways that's the whole idea. And, one of the things we haven't sort of talked about as a kind of mechanism going forward in the Philippines to improve its democracy is actually building political parties, and they've never really existed in the Philippines. And we're probably not starting from the best position to build them, but there seems to be very little kind of initiative to actually do that. And probably, unfortunately, what that means is not necessarily a continuation of Dutertismo, but a sort of serial populism. It'll just be another populist, perhaps of a different sort, with a different set of policy issues that will come along, because the structure of Philippine politics with this executive presidency and after Duterte's sort of legislative and constitutional legacy, a sort of hyper executive presidency, I think, unfortunately, it's likely to continue. But thank you very much to everyone for my part. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope we can all keep in touch going forward.
Okay, so we're at the end of the panel. Dear distinguished panelists, thank you very much for these very insightful presentations. Dr. Kenny, for your great moderation. Dear attendees, you enriched the panel with your questions and remarks. Please mark your calendars for the next session, which will take place on the 25th of May, and we will discuss different aspects of populism in Indonesia. I wish you all a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.